So tell me, Chris has told me a little bit, but tell me about how you, sorry, I'm turn off alerts. How did you start researching kind of Mr. Watkin?
I got here in '87 and I'm gay, and I kind of lived through all Section 28, birth of pride, AIDS, all of that. And I became a director of Brighton Our Story, which is a local queer history group. And that folded about 8 years ago. And after going for over 20. So I'm still very much interested in kind of Brighton's kind of queer history, but from an oral history point of view. So just ordinary people telling their tales and putting them together into stories. I guess I'm a storyteller. And where did I come across him? So I'm always on the lookout for stories that are kind of less well known. And I found David listed in some kind of who's who of Brighton. And I thought, I don't know that name. And it mentioned the Wendy light. And I thought, my spidey senses tingled. And I thought, oh yeah. So I investigated a little bit further, and he just sounded amazing.
Well, he was such an elder statesman of the whole film industry, but yeah, not a well-known name.
Chris is here.
Coming in.
I feel I'm suitably. I've got a light here. I'm trying to get a better fill light. If we're going to talk about Watkin,
yes,
we're
that's true. We should have good lighting. Just saying.
Do you want a description from a dispassionate observer about Rachael and David Watkin?
Why not? Go ahead. Okay. Rachel looks intrigued.
You see, Rachael was on the MA course at Grand Parade, and we got on so well, and at the end of which you'd actually, after the time you spent with us, transmuted yourself from fine artist into artist designer. And at the end of the course, you came and you had a burgeoning professional career making websites. You'd work with George Hardy, because Alf, you know George.
Yep.
Yeah. And he taught you all sorts of things about design. But I remember when the new year had started and you'd left, and it was exactly the same time as David Watkin came into the office. He'd been hanging around the gallery, checking the talent out before he came up to see me. And he, as long as I'd known him, he'd been working on the first volume of his memoirs. And I would get envelopes through the post. Was it green ink?
Always green ink.
Always green ink. And I think did I take you and introduce you to him as a designer?
We met at Grand Parade, and then you took me, and then we met in HOLLEYMAN and TREACHER, and it just sort of, galloped.
He was checking out the artistic talent?
Oh, yeah, a very keen eye for artistic talent.
Okay.
But then,
we're talking people, but not artwork, aren't we?
You could be in mid-conversation with him, and suddenly his head would sort of do a complete...
Yeah. And do you remember the regime with his glasses? You'd be walking with him through the streets at 4 o'clock, and you wondered why you were going to post a letter. It's because the local talent was coming off the rugby field, and you knew that he wasn't listening to you because he'd pick his glasses up and put them on and then take them off again. So as a keen indicator of looking for the local talent, artistic, of course. But Rachael, at some stage, you start in the same way as I would go over for a Bruckner symphony and a lunch before being spirited back in a taxi to the university. You went over with the family for Sunday lunch, and it was the family that he always wanted, because he would employ my son Sam, who he thought was really cute, and my other son Jack, who's a bit older, who both Scott and David thought was really glamorous. And he wasn't, he was just terribly dignified, and they thought he was terrific. But when I went over, David would always say, "Oh, is Sam coming over? My printer needs overhauling." So our family went over to him, and I always felt with you too, Rachel, that he loved the idea of a family, but it didn't eat away at his time. We were all very containable within a timetable, because his family professionally was the film crew that he worked with, and he always talked about them as if they were family, and everybody had their foibles and their patois, but they were his. And that's why he never had a manager, he never had an agent. He would put together not only a film crew for a professional gig, but also, just say, I may have mentioned it before, Alf, so forgive me, that if a certain film stock was being diminished in any way, either by quality or by production, he had lots of raw film stock stored in various places all over London. And I think one of his films, I think it may have been out of Africa, he insisted on a film stock that was no longer commercially available, but he'd arrange for it to be delivered and be used in the production. In the same way, I suppose, that he was so familiar with lenses and cameras, and every film he took as an opportunity to develop some new way of using a camera or a lens. And very often he'd persuade the director, because he was quite successful in filming films that made lots of money. They knew that if they got a Watkin film, it would be highly professional, beautifully graded, with the right camera, with an unusual lens. Like on Catch 22, he had so many technical risks he took that all of it was shaped by his whole world, his whole life was so constructed and designed. And yet when he came back to Brighton, at the end of every gig, I mentioned that, you know, he would jump in a taxi at Brighton station and get this feeling of burning off all the frustrations of his professional life, get back to the house, and he could put his music on at 4 o'clock in the morning. And because all the rooms around him were let out on a peppercorn rent to his pals, nobody would object to him settling back into Brighton again. And that was a really big thing. But when he got back, he missed that film family. And that's when we'd all get called up, because he rang I don't say most evenings, at least 4 times a week. And it sounds, or he would pick the phone up and say, "Oh, it's your boyfriend's on the phone," she'd say, and Watkin would come on, and he would tell me about the film that he'd been working on, but then he'd talk about Joseph Conrad or the Titanic or something else. And it was like spilling out information, things he'd been thinking about, to a Brighton family rather than the film family. So did you feel that, Rachel, with your family?
Yeah, I think that, well, it's funny, as you're describing it, what I remember instantly is how I felt in arriving at the MEWS. You'd before you'd knocked on the door would be pulled open, and he would kind of do this, he was so excited and delighted to see us always, wasn't he? And he'll have pre-prepared lunch or bought a delicious kind of something to have with afternoon tea. And I think my impression is that he was always, something about his childhood meant that he was always looking for family, and that maybe there was a part of us that was looking for some sort of, for me, a dad type bloke, that there was and that him regaling us with stories. His stories were, you know, peppered with the most, you know, outrageous language. It didn't matter if children were present. I mean, you know, when Frank was about 5, you know, he'd count how many times certain words were used, and you know, it was. But they were stories, just as you described, Chris. You could be talking about any kind of theme, and he would illustrate it with a conversation he'd had with someone, you know, very well known, or a little bit of, you know, outrageous gossip about something, or a technical issue about a film. That launching into the use of the brass lenses on Charge of the Light Brigade.
Yeah.
You know, and it would appear, you know, as if by magic in a much broader conversation.
Without sounding forced. And it was all part of the larger stream of what you and I would call gossip, because his gossip was really high grade gossip. It would be observations, politically, literary, and then spilling over to Duncan Lustig-PREAN. Have you met him yet?
Yes, I kind of have met Duncan in many years ago, and we chatted last week about David. Yes.
When you're asking me on the basis of the article, essay you're going to write about him, is how do I talk about Watkin and Brighton? Did you catch the sections of, I think it's Clara, where he talked about, he ended the book with a sort of a praise for Brighton. I think the key for me was always that he sort of went out into Brighton and he got his cheese. He had his rituals of going to various, but very, very strong on rituals, and bookshops were his big ritual as well, and the cheese shop. And he'd then go back home. And I know that David Plumtree told me that always he'd buy these books, and he was a big book buyer, you know, as a confirmed socialist. He would then, of course, expect the book dealer to bring them round at 4 o'clock, the books that he'd bought. He could have taken them home in a taxi, but no, you just, with a lordly gesture, bring them round at 4. And of course, Plumtree, being a lovely bloke, said, but that was an opportunity to lure Brighton into his flat. So he would bring everybody in, and I mean everybody in. There's a story
he introduced us all, didn't he? Sorry, I interrupted.
Absolutely. We were orchestrated by him in a lovely way. It's not a manipulative way. You were part of his dramatis personae. Everybody played their part in it, and being that gesture, come in.
Always, yeah. There were so many body, and you know, when he was laughing, he would hold his own shoulders like this, and he would sort of guffaw in this, you know, this. He was such a kind of thrilling delight. He was the company. He was a fab.
The hugging himself was interesting, because I've got a photograph of him talking to John Taylor, the director, and he's doing that, holding himself in. Alf, are there any, if that's the background to it, are there any questions you want to push us in a way that would suit you and your?
Yeah, I've got some questions. I was talking to Duncan, and I was saying, you know, did you ever go out on the town with David? And he was saying, no, that didn't really happen. No.
He did with Scott and Joseph, though. Yeah, Joseph's really, really sweet. I liked him a lot.
Yeah.
But Duncan was saying, you know, you didn't really go out. You went round to David's, and there was always there was always lovely music playing, and he'd cook and he'd chat to you while he was cooking, and just how lovely it was, and what a nice bloke he was.
But it was that exactly that Brighton came into him, where he could make this great circus of an evening in. But no, I remember. Rachael, didn't we meet Duncan? Did he come here to Ditchling Road? Because I've got a photograph.
Came, I think I remember. Yeah, I think that was after David died. That was after the funeral. That I can remember all meeting at yours.
All sorts of people who were really great friends with David, who weren't deliberately invited to the funeral, because you were dressed in extremely colourful clothes, Rachel, if I remember. Do you remember your wardrobe?
I do remember that I had a pink coat on, but that was just,
Yeah.
it was chance because that was the colour of my coat. But
But it wasn't,
no,
it wasn't
I mean,
funereal.
I was going to say that the funeral, I don't know how much you've kind of gathered, Alf, but
that's what Duncan was saying, that a lot of David's kind of close friends, unless they were actually involved with David's care towards the end, were just kind of pushed out.
absolutely, yeah.
It was a fun funeral. If you want to do Brighton and Watkin down the creme, because I'd done several funerals in my time. First one being Nigel Henderson, and the independent group artist, and I arrived for the funeral, and his wife was smoking this giant joint, and the undertaker came up to me and said, "Mrs. Henderson is incapable of contributing to the funeral, and she suggests, would you run it?" So I was taken into the chapel and told where to press the button that sent Nigel's body into the flames, which was terrifying. And then I had to use the line, "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. Please leave by the back door where floral tributes are available on the lawn." So that was the first time. And then a student on my course, do you remember Graham White? Now,
Yeah.
Graham died, and he'd said in his will, he was so impressed by the story, he wanted me to run his funeral. And I told Watkin, and Watkin said he'd have a word with Nicky, and he'd want me to do a sort of Eamon Andrews act in his funeral. Entirely the mainstays of the British film industry turned up for his funeral, but what he would have loved much more was to have known that his nearest and dearest were there too, and they weren't.
Amazing man with this, this culture and hilarity, and how his approach to life was about bringing us together. That, oh, you must meet Duncan, and off we'd go, and then we were there at the commissioning of Duncan's ship, and David's approach was all about connecting. It's probably a while since we've talked about Mr. Watkin, and I realise there's a lot of stuff that's still difficult.
That's been buried.
Mm.
I don't know if anything you could write about, Alf.
Yes, no, it's all
All grist to the mill.
Yeah, it's all good background story, and you mentioned Ian Summers.
Yes.
Yeah. I've spoken with Graham Ingram, who ran kind of like a car business or a garage in the MEWS in the early 70s, I think. And he talked about Roy Hattersley as a partner of David, not the famous Roy Hattersley, but I'm wondering if does that ring a bell?
Do you remember the stories about Roy? Because there was Ian, that he was his big love, and Ian committed suicide.
Yeah.
Do you know about this, Alf?
I know he died suddenly. That's all I knew.
Yeah, it was suicide.
Right.
But Roy, who had a daughter, Roy, Barry at number 8, Barry Martin, Barry knows all of that story because Barry arrived in the MEWS during that time. David and Ian lived together in Roehampton, didn't they?
Yeah.
Somewhere, I think it was Roehampton. And they bought the MEWS. They just bought number 6 at first, then they bought number 7, and then number 8, and then it all got knocked through. But Ian was an antiques dealer, so most of the furniture, most of the beautiful stuff came from it was Ian he had the eye. And there's a painting the boy with the hoop, that painting that he used to say
Yeah,
that
it was
David
on the landing. I
And he could
took a
see it from
photograph of it.
Hmm.
And, it
And
was,
he said that that was looked like Ian.
he kept it because I think what David told me that he was much more promiscuous than Ian, and he said, I want a complete sexual freedom in our relationship, and Ian got more and more depressed by this. And when he killed himself, I know David, part of what he'd never really talk about is Ian's family blamed David for pushing Ian into suicide. So it was one of the dark elements of what David was dealing with in his relationships with other people. I remember an afternoon where he said, I'm so glad to have said it because I haven't been able to talk to anybody about that sense of guilt with Ian.
But that was the early 1970s. I don't know for certain when Ian died, but it was in the early 70s, and it was a lifelong grief for David. It was, and I think Roy, he was present, but Roy, I think, brought his own difficulties. I think that, I mean, David never, I have the impression that Ian was David's big love.
Yeah.
And that thereafter, Roy, then Nicky, other boyfriends in between, you'll have heard some of these names, but
there was huge comedy. Just, I mean, many of the relationships were fraught and resulted in guilt. But I do remember David had terrific crushes on people. And I'm going to watch Rachel's face now when I say Mindergast.
Oh, Mindergast.
Yeah, such a sweet guy. Can't whether he was from Estonia.
He adored him, didn't he?
Yeah, he absolutely adored him. I've just found a photograph of Mindergast because Mindergast had absolutely minimal artistic talent. And David said to me, Chris, you've got, come over for lunch now. I want to introduce you to Mindergast, who is the most brilliant artist I have ever seen. So I went over, rushed over, and there was this sketch pad of daffodils in milk bottles, but yeah, all the time, like as with Can
I ask about Mindergast while you mentioned that name? It's an amazing name. Where's that from?
I thought he was from Estonia or Latvia.
Yeah.
Do you remember him? I've got photographs if you really. If you.
Oh no, I was just intrigued because I'd never heard it before.
Because I think, because oddly enough, I used to go over on the occasional Saturday morning to help Mendergast with his drawing because I taught at art college as well, so I'd sometimes.
Wow.
But Mendergast told me a story about his own upbringing, and I think it was Latvia for some reason. But he grew up on a farm, and I mean, being a gay boy in that situation, I mean, it was a kind of, his one opportunity in life was to get as far away from there as possible, and he
like
arrived, I mean, you'll meet Joseph. Joseph is the kindest, sweetest, loveliest. Well, he's not a lad now. He's probably, haven't seen him for 10 years, but I think David, he had huge empathy for these, these boys. He would have developed these crushes, as Chris described, but they were, he was so kind, and he wanted to help them and, improve their lives, and, he was
so devoted. He was in a shop. He was in I think he was in either a cafe or a chemist, and he was talking to a girl to his left shoulder who said, I'm at the university and I'm doing an essay on Eliot. And he said to her, oh, you, and she was with 2 other boys. And so David said to them, I've got, come back, I'll show you, can have tea at mine now, and I'll show you all my first edition Eliots. And I have found out about this within 2 days. Because what they did was he gave them the full introduction to Eliot, showed them these beautiful first editions, talked to them about their essay titles, and the girl said, oh, I would need to go to the loo. So she went upstairs, she came back, and all of them left. And I remember David saying to me that he'd had such a good afternoon helping them, and he loved showing his books off. And then he found that the girl who'd gone upstairs had rifled a jewel cabinet and taken a load of silver bits and pieces. And so we got back to David and said, look, ring the police, because you don't want to encourage. Were they really university students? And he said, no, I can't be bothered. She's welcome to it. She's welcome to it. But it depressed him, because he was in his own way really innocent, and they were they took
advantage. We all spent that last few days you know, sitting on the side of the bed, making tea. For some reason, I took to, there was the bookshelf above the bed that had all of David's childhood favorite books.
Just William.
And you know, and I took to sort of reading those to him, but he was on morphine by then, so we'd have slightly surreal kind of
and
chat.
So were you.
Oh, stop it, you. Obviously, you've got to have
go on, tell him the story.
No, well, David had see, I'm probably blushing, you can see on Zoom.
Yeah, it's suddenly changed.
David's silverware, he had these enormous spoons. I'm just saying that. But he was on Oromorph, and he'd pour some into them with a sort of big dessert spoon and drink it at the table. And he'd because he was mischievous. He just was. And he said, you've got to taste this. Honestly, not only did I taste it, but out of a spoon the size of a ladle, you know. I had one of the oddest evenings of my life, where I spent in prone, thinking that I was in the Ziegfeld Follies at the top of one of those fountains.
Wow, wonderful. I'm so jealous.
But yeah, no, so Alf, I mean, presumably you're curious about his film career.
My oral history stuff is usually more is more about the person, and kind of just ordinary people, often ordinary people's memories of other ordinary people, but in this case, you know, not an ordinary person. So no, I'm actually much more interested in your tales of kind of the relationships and people than all the kind of Hollywood stuff. Graham said that Sussex Mews almost became a little Hollywood enclave, because lots of film-related people kind of gravitated to living in the Mews. Is that true?
Didn't know.
No?
No, there was a brothel in the Mews.
Okay.
Because he one day said he peered through somebody's window who he hadn't met, and they had a hammock slung from the ceiling. And it made him laugh, I think, for the entire day, as to how this inhabitant of the Mews was developing new professional skills.
Yeah.
But I didn't know any other, because I don't know if
sorry, but I think there was a News of the World story about that. The brothel in the Mews.
Duncan mentioned the dominatrix, who was kind of exposed by one of the tabloids. That's
the one.
Which apparently delighted David.
Yeah, because David was no, I think all the other neighbours were. I mean, there was a story that Norman Wisdom had lived at the first, at number 1, but that was before David arrived, because David arrived in the MEWS in the late 60s.
Yeah. I don't know if he
68.
would have liked people from the film industry
No.
anywhere near him. He would invite them in, and I regularly, when I was around there, would answer the phone, and there was one occasion and this voice came on and said, "Oh, can I speak to David, please?" And I said, "Yeah, who is it? He's making lunch." And he said, "Oh, tell him it's Michael." So I went and said, "Somebody called Michael." "Oh God, I said, "Who is it?" He said, "Oh, it's Michael Jackson. Tell him to go out. I'll ring him up after lunch." So you'd get, people would ring David up about some, Barbra Streisand was often on the phone because she loved David, and for several reasons, all of them to do technically with the fact that he could make her look wonderful and reduce the size of her nose. So she would ring in, but I can't remember anybody filmically who had lived in the MEWS. They were all
I
civilians.
didn't know. No, yeah. And like your memory, it's David, I don't think he didn't value fame in any way. He valued kindness and you know, that like in the last, just as you described, like if the phone rang, he would just kind of fairly assertively say, "Can you answer that?" You know, and you'd feel a little bit like, "Hello, David's secretary," you know, be like, and but it might be Rita Tushingham or someone, you know, and that you realize that he'd
and she lived in Brighton, didn't she? So that's why he would say, "Oh, Tush is coming for lunch," or something.
But it would be in a very kind of familiar, routine kind of way. That having said that, whenever there was if there was any kind of event, like there was he would often ask one of us to accompany him.
Oh yeah.
And I know that JOZEF and I got lots of treats to Glyndebourne Theatre or something, because David wanted to go, and he'd always just automatically buy 2 tickets and then, you know, anticipate that you'd be happy to accompany him so that he didn't have to go on his own. But quite often that meant that at the interval he'd say in his way, "This is fucking awful, let's get out of here," you know, and you wouldn't get to see the second half or something. But I can remember going to like a couple of BAFTA events at the BAFTA, wherever that place is, going in and you know, and there'd be Ken Russell and, you know, people, you know, and there'd be a kind of, you know, a lot of that, and a catch up, but he wasn't he wasn't about, it was never about fame. It was always about the kind of gossipy stories of being away on a film, you know, you'd have weeks away somewhere, so that everyone would get to know each other, but he'd gravitate towards the other technicians quite often. That's
the key, I think. Did he ever, because I went with him, Oriel, Sam and me went to a BFI event, and Sam must have been 12, because on the first book, David delegated the finances, storage and records of subscribers. He delegated it to Sam, who was 12. So we had this large folder that Sam kept up with checks from Sean Connery and Mike Nichols. And David was very grateful that Sam did all that and said, "Bring him along to the BFI." And David gave a talk on his photography and said, my volume of memoirs has just come out. And if you look at the back there, you see that 12-year-old boy at the back of the auditorium? He's done all the records and checks. And the light swung round and there was Sam. So that was, yeah, you're right about accompanying him. it made him feel. But I think one thing probably worth just I'm talking far too much, but his skill as a cinematographer was actually, it was unique. And when people employed him, he had methods of lighting that were honed, first of all, in TV advertising. And he could light a kitchen so that if you held up a sheet to demonstrate a washing powder, it glowed, and he could do that by reflected light, not by direct light. So on the strength of that, he then made Help and The Knack films that required this glow, this lighting. And other people realized that he'd made films that looked like nobody else's films, in that they really shone out. And the key film for me was always Return to Oz, directed by Walter Murch. And Freddie Francis had been the director of photography, and he was playing up. Walter Murch had never directed a film before. He's the great sound expert in America, but they'd given him a film to direct. So Freddie Francis was sacked, and Watkin was rung up and said, would you come and rescue the film? And whereas one of the great scenes was, it's in one of the books, was a giant glass room in a palace. And actors could only stand in various places because of the positioning of the lights that would show in the camera. Now, David came in, swept all that away, and used a giant searchlight with white baffles above that lit the whole of the glass room and so the actors could move about. He was so ingenious. He wasn't dominated by the protocol of the industry. He did things as a gamble, as a risk, but they looked like nobody else's. And they were, in terms of simplicity and economy on the set, there was no one like him. And the only problem was, if you employed him, he certainly had a tongue in his head, and he let you know what he thought of you, which is why he fell out with several directors. But if they trusted him, like Mike Nichols with Catch-22, Mike Nichols was really pleased with the way it came out, because it's the first time he'd used an English cinematographer, and so cheeky, so literate, and so risky, but got the fantastic effect that people said, oh, you give it an Oscar, because they'd never seen anybody like it. So it's worthwhile stressing that he wasn't just a run-of-the-mill cinematographer.
No,
he was original,
yeah.
Technically. He was an original, as he was originally. He'd never gone to university. He felt very keenly that he hadn't had a proper education. So he constantly gave himself this education. But he was very much his own person, both in terms of intellect, talking to people, but also making films. And he described to me grading a picture, which I didn't know about, that he'd watched the whole thing on his own in the cinema, calling out numbers to individual parts of the film that needed reprinting or putting a filter over to give a continuity to the whole film. So that was, I think, really quite impressive. So I've got that bit in because that makes him feel much more of a sort of unique person, and much wanted in the film industry. Until gone 70, he couldn't get insurance for the film set anymore, so he would only do art films and small films.
But it's funny, as you were saying that, Chris, and we were talking earlier about how he really connected with people and connected people with each other, but with his ideas about film, he would often, with huge enthusiasm, share with you how he developed an idea and draw you a little diagram or something to sort of show how he did something. So he really loved to share, he'd teach, but in that sort of enthusiastic sharing way. And Catch-22, I don't know if this has been spoken about already, but he said that the idea for Catch-22 about how to light it came from walking along KEMPTOWN seafront. And there are those parts of the autumn and winter in Brighton where you can look out to sea and you can't see, the sky is as milky white as the sea and you can't see a horizon. And it's a very unique, it's the sea fret coming in or something, and it seems very unique to Brighton. But he said there was just one morning when he thought, God, that makes you feel so isolated and weirdly claustrophobic when the light sort of comes in and all you can, it struck him that would be just the perfect way to light Catch-22, that these people stuck in this insane situation, if you couldn't see the horizon, then that you'd be in a bubble. And I remember him describing that, not in a I'm teaching you about cinematography way, but in a sort of spontaneous, chatter over something. I also have a memory, sorry, of him sitting outside a cafe with him drinking coffee and him drawing on the napkin about how he lit something, and I've probably still got it somewhere, a funny little sketch where I sit there going, as he's trying to explain something, and he'd say, well, look like this. And so there was something very daddish about the way he passed on that kind of information.
Because it was, he was always saying how lucky he was.
Yeah.
That he was sexually active, but he never got AIDS. He said, God, I was so lucky I never got it. I was so lucky that my father put me into this film unit and I didn't know what it was. And I was really lucky. And I met this person. I was really lucky. But what he used to do technically, when he looked at lenses or film stock, he'd have a puckish idea that nobody else had, and he'd store it up, waiting for an opportunity to use it. And I remember that the Brighton seafront and Catch-22, but he also had an idea that he said to me, with Greek, with a portico, and you've got columns, and the columns are conceived with entasis. So you have them bigger at the bottom than at the top. And I said, yeah. He said, well, what happens if you make them straight up and you use a lens to close them off as if they had an entasis, and then you put an actor there, you get them all with pointy heads, which I thought was a fantastic idea. Imagine walking down to town to buy some cheese and having an idea of being able to photograph actors with weird pointy heads, because you look behind and you see normal columns. And he said, no, I'll never use it now because I'm not ever going to be trusted again beyond 75 with making a movie. But he had the idea, and I think so many of the things, like with in Catch-22, he told Mike Nichols that he wasn't going to light any of the principal actors or the objects. He reckoned he'd seen at one stage big fireworks going off, and there'd be enough light from the bomb bursts from special effects to light everything he wanted to see. And Mike Nichols said, no, we're not doing that, because if you get it wrong, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars. And Watkin said, no, trust me. And he said, and because Mike Nichols was having a fling with an English, I shan't mention her, Penelope, an English person, Mike Nichols was very much under Watkin's sway, because this woman had recommended David, and they said, okay, I'm going to trust you. And the sight of the American airport being bombed by its own planes is absolutely sensational, because it's not conventional film lighting, it's the actual light of the bombs, and he'd always wanted to do it. So that sort of underscores the technical bit.
I'm going to have to watch that again.
It's a stunning film.
I'd quickly like to touch on the Wendy light, because we haven't mentioned the Wendy light. Mainly my interest is his camp name Wendy.
Yeah.
I spoke to Duncan about it.
Watkin.
He said people didn't really use it outside of the business.
I was with him by the cheese shop, and a man outside the shop said, "Wendy," and he turned around and said, "Yes." And this man said, "No, I was looking for my wife." And Watkin said, "I'm sorry, I thought you were an electrician." Amazing, this what?
Like so random. But the Wendy light, I mean, it's I mean, have you seen in that, because he writes about it in Thesaurus, and but I always, my impression is that everything he learned in British transport films was set him up for life. It was like, you know, really small team of kind of chaps who would have a shed and figure things out, you know, and learning to do stuff sort of on the hoof and with very little, you know, props. And I think that it was a kind of, you know, it was like a really, for him, it seemed like a really obvious thing. It was hardly engineering. It was like a kind of, well, if we just did this and put it up on a cherry picker, and, you know, it was like, what, like lots of his ideas, that seems obvious.
But it
How
also,
has no one else done it?
yeah, but he knew who was the right technician to demand it from. And there was quite a lordly sense of, I got Bill to strap that together, to put some, put it on a cherry picker and load it up. And he just shaped it. And he had sufficient prestige to get things done.